Revenge is not served hot or cold. It is served on a screen, in high definition, with perfect audio. In the marble-lined corridors of power, everyone knew that Mateo Bellini was untouchable, a man whose tattooed hands had built an empire on fear and fire. But his wife, Laura, draped in red silk and diamonds, believed that cruelty was just another form of charm, that mocking the poor was simply dinner conversation. She thought the rules didn't apply to them. She was wrong. They both made the mistake of thinking the blonde woman refilling their espresso was just a waitress. They didn't know that some people wear aprons not because they serve, but because they are gathering evidence. This is the story of how a $50 coffee bill brought down a crime family. Before I start, comment where you are watching from and subscribe to support us. The crystal chandelier above table 7 cast fractured light across Mateo Bellini's face as he examined the leather bill folder like it was a particularly amusing joke. His tattooed fingers, decorated with symbols of violence disguised as art, drummed against the white linen tablecloth. The sound echoed through Ristorante Rossi's dining room, where oil paintings of forgotten nobility watched from gilded frames. $50, he said, his voice carrying across the hushed space. $50 American for coffee. Laura shifted in her seat, the red silk of her dress whispering against the burgundy leather booth. She reached for her wine glass, but her hand hesitated halfway. She knew that tone. It was the same one he used before someone got hurt. Valentina Bruno stood 3 feet from the table, her posture perfect. Her expression professionally neutral. The blonde hair pulled back from her face revealed nothing. No fear, no anticipation, just the practiced patience of someone who had served hundreds of entitled customers. Her black vest and crisp white shirt were immaculate despite the long shift. Her hands remained steady at her sides. 2 espressos, 1 macchiato, and service, Valentina said evenly. The price is listed on the menu, Mr. Bellini. The use of his name should have been a warning. In his world, anonymity was armor. But Mateo was too drunk on his own power to notice. You know who I am, he said, leaning back with a grin that showed too many teeth. And you still have the audacity to charge me like I'm some tourist? He looked at Laura, inviting her to share in the entertainment. Can you believe this? A peasant with a pricing gun. Laura's laugh was mechanical, a wind-up toy performing on cue. But her eyes darted to Valentina's face, searching for the crack, the moment when the waitress would crumble and apologize. It didn't come. Around them, the restaurant had gone quiet. Other diners pretended to study their plates, but every ear was tuned to table 7. The servers had retreated to the kitchen doorway like rabbits sensing a wolf. Even the classical music filtering through the speakers seemed to lower in deference to the brewing storm. I'm just doing my job, sir, Valentina said. Her voice hadn't changed pitch or tempo. The bill is $50. Mateo's grin widened into something predatory. He picked up his water glass and took a slow sip, making her wait, making her understand her place. Here's what's going to happen. Sweetheart, I'm going to walk out of here without paying a single cent, and you're going to thank me for not burning this shithole to the ground like I did to that bakery on... He stopped. Valentina's hand had moved to her apron pocket. The phone emerged in one smooth motion, screen already glowing. She placed it on the table between them, angled so both Mateo and Laura could see. Like you did to Bruno's bakery, Valentina finished for him. Her thumb pressed the play button. The video quality was grainy, shot from a high angle, security camera footage from 18 months ago. But the audio was crystal clear. Mateo's voice filled the space between them, younger but unmistakable, discussing accelerants and timing with a man whose face was obscured by shadow. The conversation was technical, almost businesslike, as they planned the destruction of a family business that had stood for 3 generations. "Make sure it's late," the recorded Mateo said. "After closing, I want the building gone, but keep it clean. No bodies. Just send the message." "And if the old man won't sell after?" the other voice asked. "Then we send another message." Laura's hand flew to her mouth. The wine glass she'd been reaching for earlier tipped, spreading red across the white tablecloth like a wound opening. She didn't seem to notice. Her eyes were locked on the screen, watching her husband, the man who'd told her he'd made his fortune in real estate and import-export, the man who'd sworn he'd left his father's criminal empire behind, casually order arson. Mateo's face had drained of color beneath his carefully maintained tan. The laughter died in his throat, strangled by the sudden understanding that the ground beneath him had just vanished. "That's not—" he started, but Valentina pressed a button and the video jumped forward to another clip. This one showed Mateo handing an envelope to the same shadowed figure outside a warehouse. The date stamp read, 3 days before Bruno's bakery became an inferno that lit up the night sky and ended with firefighters pulling Giuseppe Bruno's body from the wreckage. "The fire was supposed to be after closing," Valentina said quietly, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "But my father was in the back office, finishing the books. He always stayed late on Thursdays." Laura's sob was involuntary, a sound of pure horror escaping before she could stop it. She turned to Mateo, searching his face for denial, for explanation, for anything that would make this nightmare untrue. But Mateo wasn't looking at his wife. His eyes were fixed on Valentina, and for the first time in years, the king of silence felt genuinely afraid. Mateo's hand disappeared beneath the table so smoothly that most people wouldn't have noticed. But Valentina had been studying this man for 18 months. She knew every gesture, every tell, every violent impulse that flickered across his face before he acted on it. She watched his shoulder dip slightly as his fingers found the familiar weight of the beretta he kept holstered against his ribs. "I wouldn't," she said, her voice carrying just far enough to reach Laura, who had gone statue still in her red dress. "Because the moment your heart rate spikes above 140 beats per minute, or the moment I fail to check in, this video and 12 others like it get sent to every major news outlet in the tri-state area." Mateo's hand froze, his jaw clenched so hard Valentina could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. Around them, the restaurant remained suspended in that peculiar silence that follows a detonation. Everyone aware that something catastrophic had occurred, no one certain whether the danger had passed. "You're bluffing," he said, but his hand stayed where it was, caught between violence and calculation. Valentina reached into her other pocket and withdrew a small device, no bigger than a car key fob. She placed it on the table next to the phone. "Biometric monitor. Tracks my pulse, my location, my movement patterns. If I don't enter a 16-digit code every 12 hours, the dead man's switch activates. If my heart stops, it activates. If I'm moved more than 50 miles from this location without authorization, it activates." She paused, letting each word settle like stones dropping into still water. "If you shoot me right now, Mr. Bellini, you'll be famous by morning. Just not the kind of famous you can survive." Laura made a small sound, something between a whimper and a gasp. Her carefully applied makeup was beginning to streak, mascara trailing down her cheeks like evidence of a crime scene. She looked at her husband with the expression of someone watching a stranger emerge from a familiar face. "Mateo," she whispered, "tell me this isn't real. Tell me she's lying." But Mateo wasn't looking at his wife. His eyes were locked on Valentina, running calculations, weighing odds, searching for the weakness in her armor. She could see the wheels turning behind those cold eyes, the same eyes that had looked at her father's bakery and seen only an obstacle to profit. "What do you want?" he asked finally. His voice had lost its performative cruelty. Now it was just flat, businesslike, the tone of a man negotiating his own survival. "Money? You want money? Name your price." "I don't want your money," Valentina said. She picked up the phone and the biometric monitor, sliding both back into her pockets with deliberate care. "I want a job." Mateo blinked. It was possibly the first time in a decade that someone had surprised him. "A job? At your headquarters, whatever title you want to give me. Consultant, assistant, secretary, I don't care. But I want access. I want to see where you go, who you meet with, what you do." She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a whisper that only their table could hear. "I want to ensure you behave." "You're insane," Mateo said. But there was something else creeping into his voice now. Not quite respect. Men like Mateo Bellini didn't respect anyone. But recognition. He was seeing her clearly for the first time, understanding that the blonde waitress with the steady hands had been playing a different game all along. "Maybe," Valentina agreed. "But I'm the insane person with video evidence of you ordering a murder. And unless you want every federal prosecutor from here to Washington making your life their personal mission, you're going to give me exactly what I'm asking for." Laura stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. The sound shattered the tension like a gunshot. "I need air," she said, her voice hollow. I can't." She didn't finish the sentence, just grabbed her clutch purse and fled toward the restaurant's entrance, her heels clicking out a frantic rhythm. Mateo watched her go, something unreadable crossing his face. When he looked back at Valentina, the mask had returned, the careful neutrality of a predator forced to negotiate with prey that had grown teeth. "You think you're clever," he said quietly. "You think you've won. But you just put yourself in the lion's cage, little girl, and cages have a way of becoming coffins." Valentina picked up the leather bill folder, the original reason for this entire confrontation. She opened it, removed 2 20s and a 10 from the cash Mateo had thrown down earlier with such contempt, and placed them in her apron. Then she closed the folder and set it back on the table. "The difference between you and me, Mr. Bellini," she said, "is that I walked into this cage on purpose. You just realized you've been living in one your whole life, and I'm the one holding the key." She turned to leave, then paused. "I'll see you Monday morning, 9 a.m. Don't be late." She walked away from table 7 without looking back, leaving Mateo Bellini sitting alone in his expensive suit, surrounded by gilded frames and crystal chandeliers, finally understanding what it felt like to be hunted. The Bellini speakeasy occupied the basement of a building that officially housed an Italian import company. The entrance required 3 separate security checks, 2 locked doors, and a staircase that descended into what felt like the earth's dark heart. Valentina counted each step on her first morning, 32 stairs separating the legitimate world from the empire Mateo had built in shadow. The space itself was a carefully constructed contradiction. Exposed brick walls held vintage photographs of old New York alongside flat-screen monitors displaying security feeds. Leather booths lined the perimeter, while the center was dominated by a mahogany bar that probably cost more than most people's homes. Jazz played softly from hidden speakers, giving the whole place the atmosphere of a 1920s club that had somehow survived into the present, dragging its sins along with it. "Before we continue, My wife said, I won't get close to 3K subscribers. I need you to prove her wrong. Let's continue. Mateo sat in the largest booth at the far end, holding court like a king receiving supplicants. 3 men Valentina didn't recognize stood before him, their body language suggesting the conversation wasn't going well. She noticed the way they shifted their weight, ready to run or fight, though neither option would help them. "Valentina!" Mateo called out, spotting her. His voice was welcoming, almost warm, but his eyes were cold as February. "Come meet your new colleagues." She crossed the floor, aware that every person in the room was watching her. Word had spread quickly through Mateo's organization. The waitress who'd somehow boxed the boss into a corner, the blonde ghost who'd appeared from nowhere with evidence that could end them all. Some looked at her with curiosity, others with suspicion, but most with the wary respect reserved for unexploded ordnance. "This is Vincent, Marco, and Johnny," Mateo said, gesturing to the 3 men. "They run distribution for the north side. Gentlemen, this is Miss Bruno, my new consultant." He loaded the word with mockery, but underneath was something sharper, a warning. Vincent, the oldest of the 3, nodded cautiously. The other 2 just stared. "We were just discussing," Mateo continued, "a shortage in this month's numbers, $20,000 worth of product that seems to have evaporated into thin air." He picked up a glass of whiskey, examining it against the light. "I'm trying to understand how that happens, how 3 experienced men lose track of $20,000. Marco started to speak, but Mateo raised a hand, silencing him. "The thing is," Mateo said, his voice dropping to a conversational tone that somehow felt more dangerous than shouting, "I don't like mysteries. I don't like loose ends, and I really don't like being stolen from." What happened next occurred so fast that Valentina's training almost failed her. Mateo's hand shot out and grabbed the whiskey glass, then swung it in a vicious arc that connected with Vincent's temple. The sound of crystal meeting skull was sickeningly wet. Vincent dropped like a marionette with cut strings, blood already pooling beneath his head. "Now," Mateo said, looking at the remaining 2 men. "Who wants to tell me the truth?" Johnny broke first, words tumbling out about a poker game, about debts, about Vincent skimming to cover losses. Marco confirmed it, his voice shaking, both of them desperate to distance themselves from the man bleeding on the floor. Valentina kept her face absolutely still. She'd known what Mateo was capable of, had seen the aftermath of his violence in the blackened ruins of her father's bakery, but witnessing it firsthand was different. This was personal, intimate, the kind of casual brutality that revealed more than any surveillance footage ever could. Mateo listened to their confession, nodding occasionally, then waved them away. "Get him to a hospital. Tell them he fell. And make sure the 20,000 is back in my accounts by Friday, or you'll both be joining him." The 2 men scrambled to lift Vincent, who was groaning now, semi-conscious. They half-carried, half-dragged him toward the stairs, leaving a thin trail of blood across the expensive floor. When they were gone, Mateo turned to Valentina. She hadn't moved from where she stood, hadn't flinched, hadn't given him the satisfaction of any reaction at all. "Welcome to the family business," he said, swirling what remained of his whiskey. "Still think you want this job?" "I don't want it," Valentina replied evenly. "I need it. There's a difference." Mateo stood, closing the distance between them. He was 6 inches taller, 40 pounds heavier, and radiated the kind of physical menace that came from a lifetime of hurting people. He stood close enough that she could smell his cologne, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. You should be terrified right now, he said softly. You should be wondering if I'm going to do to you what I just did to Vincent. Whether your little insurance policy will save you if I decide you're more trouble than you're worth. Valentina didn't step back. She held his gaze, counting her heartbeats, keeping her breathing steady. The biometric monitor in her pocket was recording everything: her pulse, her stress levels, the subtle physiological markers that separated fear from control. You know what I'm wondering, she said. I'm wondering how that surveillance camera in the corner captured what you just did. I'm wondering if the man you sent to the hospital will keep quiet, or if he'll start thinking about immunity deals. I'm wondering how many more mistakes you'll make while I'm standing here documenting them. Something flickered across Mateo's face. Rage, maybe, or frustration at being matched, move for move, by someone he'd dismissed as insignificant. The video, he said. It wasn't a question. Check-in isn't due for another 7 hours, Valentina confirmed. But I can always adjust the schedule if you'd like to test the system's responsiveness. Mateo stared at her for a long moment, then stepped back. He drained his whiskey in one swallow and set the glass down with deliberate care. Your office is in the back, he said. 3rd door on the left. I want reports on all financial transactions, all meetings, all movements of personnel. You want access? You've got it. Let's see how long you last. Valentina walked past him toward the hallway he'd indicated, her footsteps steady on the blood-marked floor. She could feel his eyes on her back, measuring, calculating, planning. The lion had let her into his den, but only because he thought he could eat her later. He was wrong. The knock on Valentina's office door came at 11:47 p.m. on her 3rd day inside the Bellini organization. She'd been reviewing financial statements, tracking the elaborate shell game Mateo used to launder money through a network of legitimate businesses. The numbers told stories of their own. Restaurants that reported impossible profits, construction companies that built nothing, import firms that never seemed to import anything except cash. She knew who it was before she opened the door. Laura Bellini stood in the dimly lit hallway, wearing jeans and a cashmere sweater, her hair pulled back in a ponytail, her face scrubbed clean of the makeup she'd worn at the restaurant. Without the armor of designer clothes and carefully applied cosmetics, she looked younger, more vulnerable, and infinitely more real. He doesn't know I'm here, Laura said, her voice barely above a whisper. He's upstairs in a meeting. I need to talk to you. Valentina stepped aside, letting her enter. The office was small and sparse. A desk, 2 chairs, a filing cabinet, and a window that looked out onto a brick wall. Not the kind of space given to valued employees, but Valentina hadn't expected hospitality. She'd expected exactly what she'd gotten, a cage with a desk. Laura sat in the visitor's chair, her hands twisted together in her lap. Up close, Valentina could see the shadows under her eyes, the exhaustion that 3 sleepless nights had carved into her features. Since the restaurant, since the video, Laura had been living in a different world, one where the man she'd married was a stranger, and the life she'd built was constructed on bones. I keep thinking about your father, Laura said finally. Giuseppe Bruno. I looked him up. He won awards for his ciambelle. The mayor came to his bakery's 50th anniversary. She looked up at Valentina, her eyes red-rimmed. I ate there once, 6 years ago, before I met Mateo. You made my cappuccino. Valentina remembered. A woman in a business suit, young and ambitious, talking on her phone about closing a deal. She'd left a generous tip and a warm smile. The memory felt like it belonged to a different lifetime. Why are you here, Mrs. Bellini? Laura. Please. She took a shaky breath. I need to know what you want. Mateo won't tell me anything, except that you're handling some consulting work. But I know what I saw. I know what you have on him. So I need to understand. Are you here to destroy him? Because if you are, you need to know that I can't just watch that happen. Despite everything, despite the video, he's still my husband. The words came out like a confession, and Valentina heard the war being fought beneath them. This was a woman caught between the person she'd believed herself to be and the person she was discovering she'd become. Someone who'd looked the other way for so long that she'd forgotten what she was avoiding. What do you know about your husband's business? Valentina asked, taking the other chair so they sat across from each other, no desk between them. I know what everyone knows. He's connected. His family has always been connected, but I run the legitimate side, the property holdings, the investment portfolios, the corporate acquisitions, everything legal. Laura's voice grew firmer, more defensive. I have an MBA from Columbia. I've built a real estate empire that's worth $70 million. That's my work, not his. And where did the seed money come from? The question hung in the air like smoke. Laura's jaw tightened, but she didn't answer. Valentina leaned forward. I've spent the last 3 days reviewing your husband's finances. The legitimate businesses you run? They're funded by drug money, extortion money, money from protection rackets that bleed small business owners dry. Every property you've acquired, every stock you've purchased, every dollar you've invested started as blood money. She paused, softening her voice. You're not separate from his crimes, Laura. You're the machinery that makes them respectable. Laura stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. I didn't know. Not all of it. Not the extent. But you suspected. The word stopped Laura mid-protest. She stood there, trembling. And Valentina watched her face cycle through denial, anger, and finally, devastatingly, recognition. The recognition that comes when someone holds up a mirror you've been avoiding for years. I told myself it was old money, Laura whispered, that his family had made questionable choices in the past, but that we were moving forward, building something clean. I told myself I was the redemption arc. She laughed bitterly. How stupid does that sound now? Valentina stood and moved to the window, looking out at the brick wall. My father believed in redemption too. He gave second chances to people who needed them, hired ex-convicts, gave them real jobs, helped them build new lives. One of them was a man named Sal Romano, who used to run with the Bellini crew. She turned back to Laura. Mateo saw that as poaching, as disrespect. So he burned down 3 generations of my family's work and killed the man who built it. Laura's hand went to her mouth, that same gesture from the restaurant. I came here planning to destroy your husband, Valentina continued, to document every crime, every transaction, every moment of violence, until I had enough to put him away forever. I was going to use everyone around him as collateral damage because I didn't care who else fell as long as he did. She paused, studying Laura's face. But then you showed up at my door at midnight, asking what I want. And I realized something. You're not collateral damage. You're the key. The key to what? To doing this right. To making sure that when Mateo falls, the empire doesn't just transfer to the next violent man in line. You control the legitimate businesses, the real assets, the parts of his organization that could actually help this community instead of bleeding it dry. Valentina moved closer. I don't want to use you, Laura. I want to turn you. Help me dismantle your husband's criminal operations, and together we can salvage something worth saving. Laura looked at her for a long moment, and Valentina could see the calculation happening behind those exhausted eyes. This wasn't the woman in the red dress who'd laughed at the idea of paying for coffee. This was someone standing at a crossroads, finally forced to choose who she wanted to be. "If I help you," Laura said slowly, "he'll know. He'll come after both of us." "He already wants to come after both of us," Valentina replied. "The question is whether we face him separately or together." Laura walked to the desk and picked up one of the financial statements Valentina had been reviewing. She stared at it, at the proof of what her legitimacy had been built upon, and something hardened in her expression. "Tell me what you need." The first raid hit on a Tuesday morning at 4:47 a.m. Valentina was awake when her phone buzzed with the news. A warehouse in Red Hook, one of Mateo's primary distribution centers, swarmed by federal agents with a warrant so specific it listed exact locations of hidden compartments built into the floor. By the time the sun rose, 3 of Mateo's men were in custody, and $200,000 worth of product was tagged as evidence. Mateo called an emergency meeting for noon. Valentina arrived early, taking her usual position in the corner of the speakeasy, where she could observe without seeming to participate. She'd learned that invisibility was a skill, that powerful men often forgot about the quiet woman taking notes until it was too late to guard their words. The room filled quickly. Lieutenants, enforcers, moneymen, all of them wearing variations of the same expression, equal parts anger and fear. They understood what a federal raid meant. The wolves were at the door, and someone had given them the address. Mateo entered last, and Valentina noted immediately that something had shifted. His movements were too sharp, his eyes too bright. He'd always been controlled in his violence, calculated in his cruelty, but now she saw the edges of something raw. Paranoia had a particular scent, and it was filling the room like gasoline fumes waiting for a spark. "We have a rat," he announced without preamble. No greeting, no pretense of civility, just the accusation, dropped like a stone into still water. "The feds had our floor plans. They knew which panels were false, which crates were marked for special handling. That's not luck, that's information." The room erupted in a chaos of voices, everyone talking at once, proclaiming innocence, pointing fingers. Mateo let it continue for exactly 30 seconds, then slammed his fist on the bar hard enough to crack the mahogany. "Enough!" he roared, and the silence that followed was absolute. "Tommy, step forward." Tommy Russo had been with the Bellini family for 15 years. He'd started as a driver, worked his way up to lieutenant, earned his position through loyalty and competence. He was 42 years old, married, with twin daughters in Catholic school. Valentina had reviewed his file. Nothing in his history suggested betrayal. But Mateo had decided, and in this world, accusation and conviction were the same thing. Tommy came forward slowly, his face pale. "Boss, I swear on my daughter's lives, I would never—" "Your daughter Maria," Mateo interrupted, his voice suddenly soft, conversational. "She's what, 10 years old? Goes to St. Catherine's? Smart kid, I hear. Good at math." The threat was so obvious it didn't need to be spoken. Tommy's hands began to shake. "Mateo," Valentina said from her corner, drawing every eye in the room. It was the first time she'd spoken in one of these meetings without being directly addressed. "The timeline doesn't work. Tommy was in Atlantic City when the warehouse floor plans would have been accessed. I have the surveillance logs." She did have the logs. She'd also been the one who'd fed the warehouse information to Laura, who'd passed it to a federal prosecutor through her attorney. But Tommy didn't know that, and neither did Mateo. "Surveillance can be faked," Mateo said, but his eyes narrowed. And since when do you speak in these meetings? Since you hired me to consult on security breaches. This is a security breach. She kept her voice level, professional. If you want to find your leak, you need evidence, not impulse. For a moment, she thought she'd overplayed her hand. Mateo's jaw clenched, and she could see him weighing whether the video insurance was worth tolerating her interference. Around them, the other men watched with the fascination of spectators at a car crash, uncertain whether to intervene. Then Mateo smiled, and Valentina recognized the expression. It was the same smile he'd worn in the restaurant before everything changed, the smile of a man who'd decided someone was going to suffer, and the only question was how much. "You're right," he said pleasantly. "We need evidence." He turned back to Tommy. "So let's find some." What followed was methodical and brutal. Mateo didn't use the explosive violence he'd shown Vincent. This was slower, more personal. He asked questions between blows, accusations punctuated by the sound of fist meeting, flesh, bone, cartilage. Tommy's denials became pleas. Pleas became screams. Screams became silence, broken only by sobbing. Valentina kept her hand in her pocket. Fingers wrapped around her phone. The audio recorder had been running since the meeting started. Every word, every accusation, every sound of violence was being captured in crystal clarity. This wasn't just evidence of assault. This was evidence of a man losing control, of an organization eating itself from the inside. She forced herself to watch, to not look away, because looking away would be noticed. But inside, a cold fury was building. This was what her father had faced, this casual, creative cruelty, this absolute certainty that power meant the right to destroy. "He didn't do it," someone finally said. Marco, one of the men who'd survived the earlier confrontation with Vincent, stepped forward. "Boss, look at him. If he knew anything, he'd have said it by now. You've beaten it out of him if it was there." Mateo stepped back. Breathing hard, his knuckles bloody. Tommy lay crumpled on the floor, conscious but barely, his face already swelling into something unrecognizable. "Get him out," Mateo said. "Take him to the doctor, patch him up, and someone find me the real rat before I have to do this again." The meeting dissolved in hurried movements, men scrambling to remove Tommy, to disperse, to put distance between themselves and their unraveling boss. Valentina remained in her corner, watching Mateo pour himself a drink with shaking hands. "You should have let me handle it," he said without looking at her. "Your interference made me look weak." "Your beating of an innocent man made you look unhinged," Valentina replied. "There's a difference." Mateo turned, and for the first time since she'd entered his world, she saw something beyond calculation in his eyes. It was fear, raw and desperate, the fear of a man watching his empire crack and unable to stop it. "You did this," he said quietly. "Somehow, you're behind this. I don't know how, I can't prove it, but I know." Valentina met his gaze steadily. "Check-in is in 4 hours," she said. "I suggest you spend that time looking for actual evidence instead of conspiracy theories." She walked out of the speakeasy, leaving Mateo alone with his paranoia and his blood-stained hands, and she didn't let herself smile until she was 3 blocks away. The recording was already uploading to the cloud. The opportunity came 3 weeks after the Tommy Russo beating, when Mateo flew to Miami for a meeting with suppliers he couldn't conduct over the phone. He'd be gone for 36 hours, which meant Valentina had 1 night to do what she'd been planning since her first day in the speakeasy. The safe was hidden behind a false panel in Mateo's private office, a room she'd only entered twice under his supervision. She'd spent those 2 visits memorizing details, the slight gap in the wainscoting on the west wall, the way Mateo's eyes flickered toward it when discussing certain topics, the protective way he positioned himself between the wall and everyone else. She waited until 2 a.m., when the speakeasy was empty except for a single guard on the main entrance 3 floors up. The building's security system was sophisticated, but Laura had provided the codes, another small betrayal in the cascade of betrayals that would eventually bury Mateo Bellini. Valentina worked by the light of a penlight, clenched between her teeth, her fingers steady despite the adrenaline singing through her veins. The panel opened with a soft click, revealing a wall safe that probably cost more than most cars. She'd learned safe-cracking from a YouTube channel, run by a former locksmith, spending nights practicing on models she'd bought online. The skill had seemed absurd at the time, melodramatic, something from a movie rather than real life. But here she was, ear pressed against cold steel, listening for the whisper of tumblers falling into place. It took 18 minutes. When the door swung open, she allowed herself exactly 3 seconds of relief before focusing on the contents. Cash. Predictably. Thick stacks of hundreds bound with paper bands. A handgun she didn't touch. Passports. 3 of them, each with Mateo's photo but different names. And there, at the back, a leather-bound ledger that looked older than the safe itself. Valentina pulled it out carefully, aware that she was holding the kind of evidence that could dismantle a criminal organization or get her killed, depending on how she used it. The pages were filled with handwriting she recognized as Mateo's, meticulous records of transactions that would never appear on any official document. Names, dates, amounts, all documented with the precision of a man who trusted nothing and no one. She photographed each page with her phone, working quickly but carefully, making sure every line was legible. The ledger went back 7 years, and as she progressed through the pages, she began to understand the true architecture of Mateo's empire. The legitimate businesses Laura managed weren't just laundering his money, they were the foundation of an elaborate liability shield, designed to protect him while exposing everyone else. Then she found the section marked with a red tab, and her blood went cold. The pages detailed what Mateo called contingency protocol. It was a blueprint for survival if the federal investigation closed in, a carefully constructed plan to shift all criminal liability onto Laura. Forged documents showed her authorizing suspicious transactions. Fabricated emails demonstrated her knowledge of illegal operations. Bank accounts in her name, opened with her signature, holding money that could be traced back to drug sales and extortion. The plan was elegant and monstrous. If the feds came for Mateo, he would give them Laura instead. His wife, his business partner, the woman who'd believed she was building something legitimate. She would go to prison for money laundering, racketeering, possibly even conspiracy to commit murder. And Mateo would walk away, the grieving husband betrayed by his ambitious wife. Valentina's hands shook as she photographed the pages. She'd known Mateo was capable of violence, had witnessed his cruelty firsthand. But this was different. This wasn't rage or impulse. This was premeditated betrayal, years in the making, aimed at the one person who'd stood beside him. She returned the ledger to its exact position, closed the safe, replaced the panel. Every movement was automatic now, her mind racing ahead to what came next. She needed to reach Laura before Mateo returned from Miami. Once he was back, he'd be watching too closely, suspicious of any private communication between them. The drive to Laura's apartment took 20 minutes through empty streets. Valentina had the address from the personnel files, a penthouse in Tribeca that Laura maintained separately from the home she shared with Mateo, a space of her own, though she probably didn't realize how much she'd need it. The doorman recognized Valentina from her previous visit, when Laura had brought her here to review financial documents away from Mateo's surveillance. He nodded her through without question, and she took the elevator to the 23rd floor, watching the numbers climb while her mind replayed the ledger's contents. Laura answered the door in a silk robe, her hair loose around her shoulders, her expression shifting from surprise to alarm when she saw Valentina's face. What happened? Is it Mateo? He's planning to frame you, Valentina said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. For everything. If the feds get close, you're going to prison while he disappears. Laura stood frozen in her doorway, the color draining from her face. That's not possible. I'm his wife. We're building this together. He wouldn't. I found his contingency plan. It's documented, detailed, ready to execute. Valentina pulled out her phone, pulling up the photographs of the ledger. He's been preparing this for years, Laura. Every legitimate transaction you've made, every business decision, every signature. He's been building a cage around you disguised as a partnership. Laura took the phone with trembling hands, scrolling through the images. Valentina watched her face as she read. Saw the moment when disbelief crumbled into comprehension. This wasn't the woman who'd sat in the restaurant laughing at a waitress. This wasn't even the woman who'd come to Valentina's office seeking answers. This was someone watching the foundation of her life reveal itself as quicksand. These documents, Laura whispered, these signatures, they're real. I signed these. I authorized these transactions. He told me they were for the real estate acquisitions, for the expansion into New Jersey. She looked up at Valentina, her eyes wide with horror. He's been building my prison since the beginning. Since before the beginning, Valentina corrected. He chose you because you had the credentials, the education, the legitimacy he needed. You weren't his partner, Laura. You were always his escape route. Laura walked to the window. Looking out at the city lights, her reflection ghostly in the glass. When she spoke again, her voice was different, harder, colder, emptied of the last remnants of the woman who'd believed in redemption arcs. Tell me what we need to do. Valentina joined her at the window, and together they began planning the destruction of Mateo Bellini's carefully constructed world. Valentina realized her mistake the moment she heard the office door lock behind her. She'd returned to photograph the final section of the ledger, the pages she'd missed during her first visit, because she'd prioritized warning Laura. It was a calculated risk. Mateo wasn't due back from Miami until tomorrow morning, and she needed those last pages to complete the picture of his offshore accounts. Without them, the federal prosecutors would have half a puzzle. Enough to wound but not kill. But the soft click of the lock told her that her calculations had been wrong. "You're early," she said, without turning around, buying seconds to assess her options. The office had one door, now locked, one window, reinforced glass, 20 feet above an alley. Her phone was in her pocket, the biometric monitor reading her suddenly elevated heart rate. "I took an earlier flight," Mateo said from behind her. His voice was calm, almost pleasant, the same tone he'd used before beating Tommy Russo. "Had a feeling I should check on things at home. Funny how instinct works." Valentina turned slowly. Mateo stood in front of the locked door, and he wasn't alone. Two men she recognized as his personal security flanked him, both carrying the kind of bulk that came from gymnasiums and violence. Between them stood a third figure, a thin man in glasses holding what looked like a tablet computer. "I believe you've been looking for this," Mateo said, holding up the leather ledger. It was open to the contingency protocol section, the pages she'd photographed for Laura. "Took me a while to realize someone had been in my safe. You're very careful, I'll give you that. But you left the pages slightly out of order, maybe 0.5 millimeter. Most people wouldn't notice." He smiled. "I'm not most people," Valentina's mind raced through possibilities, scenarios, escape routes. Her hand moved toward her pocket, toward the phone and the dead man's switch that had kept her alive for the past month. "I wouldn't bother," Mateo said, nodding toward the man with the tablet. "Meet Dennis. He's a specialist in electronic countermeasures. Very expensive, very thorough. He's been jamming all wireless signals in this building for the last 45 minutes. Your phone? Right now, it's just a very expensive paperweight." The words hit like a physical blow. Valentina pulled out her phone anyway, desperately checking for signal. Nothing. No bars, no data, no connection to the cloud server that held Mateo's secrets. The dead man's switch that had protected her, that had made her untouchable, was dead. "It's actually quite elegant," Mateo continued, moving farther into the room. The two security men stayed by the door, blocking any chance of escape. "See, I realized something after Tommy. You were too confident, too comfortable. You acted like someone who had all the power, and that bothered me. So I started thinking, what if your insurance policy isn't as foolproof as you claimed? What if there's a weakness?" He gestured to Dennis, who held up the tablet, showing a technical display Valentina couldn't fully pass. "Turns out, your dead man's switch needs constant connectivity. Break that connection for more than 90 minutes, and the system assumes a malfunction rather than a threat. It goes into a safe mode, waiting for you to re-authenticate manually. Very smart design, actually. Prevents false alarms from subway tunnels or dead zones. But it also means that if someone jams your signal for, say, 2 hours, your doomsday device never triggers." Valentina's heart hammered against her ribs. She forced herself to breathe steadily to keep the fear from showing on her face. The biometric monitor was still recording her vital signs, but without a signal to transmit them, the data was trapped, useless. "I can see you doing the math," Mateo said, and now his voice carried that edge of satisfaction she remembered from the restaurant, trying to figure out if there's a play left. "Let me save you the trouble. There isn't. Your backup plan is offline. Your insurance policy is void. And you're in my office, after hours, caught in the act of stealing from my personal safe. No witnesses, no evidence, no way out." He moved closer, and Valentina saw the transformation happening. This was the real Mateo emerging, the man who'd been restrained by necessity for weeks. The careful mask of the businessman was cracking, revealing the predator underneath. His eyes held the same gleeful cruelty she'd seen in the video of him ordering her father's death. "You thought you were so clever," he said softly. "Walking into my organization, making demands, acting like you had any real power. But you were just a waitress with a recording. And now?" He spread his hands. "Now you're just a problem that needs to be disposed of." The laugh started low and built slowly, that same booming sound that had filled Ristorante Rossi when he'd mocked her over a coffee bill. It echoed off the walls of the office, bouncing back from the bulletproof glass, filling the space with the sound of his victory. "The look on your face," he gasped between laughs. "It's even better than I imagined. You actually believed you could beat me. You, with your dead father, and your moral righteousness, and your little revenge fantasy. Did you really think I got where I am by being stupid? By letting some nobody with a smartphone take me down?" Valentina's hand closed around the phone in her pocket, gripping it like a talisman, even though she knew it was useless. She thought of Laura, waiting for her signal that the final evidence had been gathered. She thought of her father, who'd died believing in second chances and redemption. She thought of all the careful planning, all the risk, all the time spent building a case that was now trapped behind a signal jammer and a locked door. Mateo wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, the gesture eerily familiar. "Marco," he said to one of the security men, "bring the car around to the service entrance, somewhere quiet, somewhere deep. Make sure we have everything we need for a thorough clean-up." "And the body?" Marco asked. Mateo looked at Valentina, his smile widening. "The harbor. Let the fish have her. Seems poetic, doesn't it? She tried to drown me in evidence, so she drowns for real." He turned toward the door, already moving past her, already treating her as dealt with, as finished. The arrogance was complete, total. The same arrogance that had made him laugh at a $50 bill and order a father murdered over a business dispute. "One question," Valentina said, her voice steady despite everything. "Before you kill me, I need to know, did you even hesitate? Before you ordered the fire that killed my father, did you think about it for even a second?" Mateo paused, considering the question with what seemed like genuine thoughtfulness. Then he shrugged. "No," he said simply. "Business is business, nothing personal." He reached for the door handle, and Valentina counted the seconds until the lock clicked open, until the moment when her last chance would disappear forever. The gunshot shattered the moment before Mateo could turn the door handle. The sound was deafening in the confined space, followed immediately by Mateo's scream, a raw animal sound of pain and shock. He collapsed against the door, his hand clutching his thigh where blood was already spreading across his expensive trousers in a dark, wet stain. Everyone froze. Marco and the other security man reached for their weapons, but stopped when they saw who stood in the doorway that had just opened from the private entrance. The door Valentina hadn't known existed, the one that connected Mateo's office to the executive suite. Laura Bellini stood with a gun held in both hands, her stance professional, her face absolutely calm. She wore black from head to toe, and her hair was pulled back severely, making her look like someone preparing for war rather than the society wife who'd sat in a red dress mocking waitresses. "Drop your weapons," she said to Marco and his partner. Her voice was steady, carrying the authority of someone who'd made a decision and would follow through regardless of consequence. "Now, on the floor. Kick them toward me." The two men looked at Mateo, who was gasping in pain, his face gone white. He tried to speak, but the words came out as incomprehensible sounds, shock overriding his ability to command. "She's not bluffing," Valentina said quietly. "I'd do what she says." Something in her tone convinced them. The guns clattered to the floor, slid across polished wood, stopped at Laura's feet. She kicked them further behind her without taking her eyes off the room, her own weapon never wavering from center mass on Marco. "Laura," Mateo finally managed, his voice strangled with pain and disbelief. "What are you doing? Put the gun down. You don't understand." "I understand perfectly," Laura interrupted. She stepped fully into the room, and Valentina saw what she held in her other hand, her phone, screen still glowing. "Valentina sent me a recording 47 minutes ago, before your jammer went active. I've been listening to you explain how I'm going to prison while you disappear to the Cayman Islands. How I was always your escape route. How our marriage was a 7-year insurance policy against prosecution." She moved closer to Mateo, who had slumped against the door, pressing his hand against the wound. The blood was flowing steadily, though not arterially. Laura had aimed carefully, professionally. Valentina wondered where a Columbia MBA had learned to shoot like that, then decided there were many things about Laura she'd underestimated. "I gave you everything," Laura said, and now emotion crept into her voice. Not sadness, but rage, pure and cold. "My education, my reputation, my legitimacy. I built your empire into something that could exist in daylight. I turned your dirty money into real estate, into stocks, into actual wealth, and you were planning to throw me away like garbage. Baby, listen, Mateo started, trying to use the endearment, the familiar manipulation. Don't, Laura snapped. Don't you dare. I listened to you laugh about it, Mateo. You told Dennis it was brilliant, how I'd signed all those documents without reading the fine print. How I'd been so eager to prove myself that I'd built my own cage. Her hand tightened on the gun. You were laughing, just like you laughed at Valentina, just like you laughed when you told your men to burn down a bakery with a man inside. Dennis, who'd been standing frozen with his tablet, suddenly bolted for the main door. Laura's gun tracked him instantly, and her shot, when it came, hit the doorframe inches from his head. He stopped, hands raised, understanding that she was willing to miss once, but wouldn't, twice. Everyone stays, Laura said. This ends tonight. She turned to Valentina. The ledger? Do you have what you need? Valentina nodded, pulling out her phone even though it was useless in the jammed building. I photographed most of it, but we need the physical evidence too. The courts will want the original. Laura walked to Mateo's safe. The panel was still open from Valentina's interrupted search, and retrieved the leather-bound book. She also pulled out the stack of fabricated documents, the ones showing her signature on illegal transactions, and a USB drive Valentina hadn't seen before. Everything, Laura said, handing them to Valentina. The ledger, the contingency protocol, and this drive has the offshore account information. Passwords, access codes, transfer histories. Mateo thought he was the only one who knew the safe combination. She smiled without humor. I've known it for 3 years. I just never had a reason to look until you showed me what I should be looking for. Mateo made a sound that might have been laughter or sobbing. You bitch! You ungrateful, treacherous! The next shot hit the floor 6 inches from his hand, cutting off the insult. Laura's expression hadn't changed. You don't get to speak, she said. Not anymore. You've said enough for a lifetime. Valentina moved to the window and checked her phone again. Still no signal, but she could see Dennis's tablet on the floor where he'd dropped it. She picked it up, found the jamming application, and shut it down. Her phone immediately came alive with notifications, missed check-ins, system warnings, backup protocols activating. The feds will be here in minutes, she said, reading the alerts. The dead man's switch logged the connectivity loss. When it came back online and saw I hadn't checked in, it triggered the full release. Everything's going public. The videos, the recordings, the financial documents, all of it. Mateo's face contorted with rage and despair. He tried to stand, perhaps to make one last desperate move, but his injured leg buckled and he collapsed again. The security men watched their boss reduced to a bleeding, broken figure on the floor, and neither moved to help him. 7 years, Laura said quietly, looking down at her husband. 7 years I believed in you. Believed we were building something together. But you were just using me, the same way you use everyone. She turned to Valentina. There's a service elevator at the end of the hall. We should go before the police arrive. I'd rather meet them at the precinct with my attorney than be found standing over my bleeding husband with a gun. Valentina gathered the physical evidence, securing it in her bag. As they moved toward the door, Marco spoke for the first time. Mrs. Bellini, he said, what should we do? Laura looked back at him, at Dennis, at Mateo slumped and bleeding, at the office that had been the heart of a criminal empire. Call an ambulance, she said, and then call your lawyers. You're all going to need them. She and Valentina walked out together, leaving Mateo Bellini alone with his shattered leg and his dying empire, his laughter finally permanently silenced. The police arrived in waves, their sirens painting the night in blue and red. Valentina and Laura were 2 blocks away when the first units screamed past them toward the speakeasy, followed by unmarked sedans carrying federal agents who'd been waiting months for this exact moment. The dead man's switch had delivered everything: videos, audio recordings, financial documents, the complete architecture of Mateo Bellini's criminal empire, all dumped simultaneously into the inboxes of every major law enforcement agency and news outlet in the tri-state area. By dawn, the story was everywhere. Cable news played the restaurant video on loop, Mateo's voice ordering the arson, his laughter at the $50 bill, the moment when his world had started to crack. Social media exploded with outrage and fascination. The tattooed Don who'd ruled the underworld from the shadows was suddenly the most visible man in America, and visibility was a death sentence for someone in his position. Valentina spent 6 hours in an interview room at the FBI field office, walking federal prosecutors through 18 months of investigation. They listened with the intensity of people who'd been handed their career-making case on a silver platter. The lead prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Chen, kept shaking her head in disbelief. "You understand," Chen said during a break, "that what you did was incredibly dangerous, criminally reckless even, if anything had gone wrong." "Everything went wrong," Valentina interrupted. "I just had a very good backup plan." Chen smiled despite herself. "Laura Bellini is in the next room, by the way. Her attorney is negotiating immunity in exchange for testimony. She's giving us everything: shell companies, bribery schemes, connections to other crime families. She kept records we didn't even know existed." "She's good with records," Valentina said. "It's what made her valuable to him." "Until it made her dangerous," Chen agreed. 3 days later, Valentina stood outside the federal courthouse and watched Mateo Bellini be transferred from a prison transport to the building. His leg was in a cast, his face gaunt from pain and fury. The crowd that had gathered shouted questions and accusations, and somewhere in that chaos, Mateo's eyes found Valentina's. Even from 50 feet away, she could see the hatred, the impotent rage of a man who'd lost everything and couldn't understand how. He opened his mouth, probably to scream threats or promises of revenge, but the federal marshals pushed him forward, and whatever he'd wanted to say was swallowed by the noise of the crowd and the closing courthouse doors. She never heard his voice again. The divorce papers were filed that afternoon. Laura's attorney released a statement describing her as a victim of manipulation, a woman who'd believed she was building legitimate businesses while her husband used her education and reputation as camouflage for his crimes. The public bought it partially, enough to give her a path forward, though she'd never fully escape the association with Mateo's name. Valentina met her one final time at a coffee shop in Chelsea, 2 weeks after the arrest. Laura looked different somehow, thinner, older, but also more solid, like someone who'd been assembled from fragments and finally glued back together into a coherent whole. "The DA accepted the immunity deal," Laura said, stirring sugar into her espresso. "I testify against Mateo and anyone else they're prosecuting, and I walk away with a criminal record that stays clean. The civil suits are another matter, apparently. A lot of people want the money I made managing his empire." "You'll survive it," Valentina said. "You're good at surviving." "I'm good at lying to myself," Laura corrected. "There's a difference." She looked up, meeting Valentina's eyes. "I knew, you know. Not everything, not the extent of it. But I knew something was wrong. I just convinced myself it was old sins, past mistakes, nothing to do with me. I told myself I was different, special, that my love could somehow redeem him. She laughed bitterly. How naive does that sound? Human, Valentina said. It sounds human. Laura reached across the table and squeezed Valentina's hand once, briefly. Thank you. For showing me the truth, even when I didn't want to see it. For giving me a chance to choose who I wanted to be. She stood, gathering her purse. I'm moving to California. Starting over, new name, new life. The lawyers say it's the smartest play. Let the news cycle move on. Rebuild somewhere else. Good luck, Valentina said, and meant it. You too. Laura paused at the door. What will you do now? Go back to waiting tables? Valentina smiled. I'm thinking about law school, actually. Turns out I'm good at building cases. After Laura left, Valentina sat finishing her coffee, watching the city move past the window. She thought about her father, about the bakery, about the 18 months she'd spent planning revenge. It had consumed her completely, turned her into someone harder and colder than Giuseppe Bruno would have recognized. But it was done now. Matteo would spend the rest of his life in prison, his empire scattered, his name synonymous with brutality and arrogance. The question was who Valentina would become next. She took the subway to the old neighborhood, getting off at the stop her father had used every morning for 30 years. The walk to the bakery lot took 10 minutes, through streets that had changed and hadn't changed, new businesses in old buildings, familiar faces grown older. The lot where Bruno's bakery had stood was empty, surrounded by a chain-link fence, covered in faded notices and graffiti. The building next door still showed scorch marks from the fire, a permanent scar on the neighborhood's face. Valentina stood at the fence, her fingers threading through the cold metal, and let herself remember. Her father's laugh, so different from Matteo's, warm and genuine. The sound of someone who found joy in simple things. The smell of bread baking at 4 in the morning. The way Giuseppe had treated everyone who walked through his door with dignity, whether they were buying a single roll or ordering for a wedding. The belief he'd carried that people deserved second chances, that redemption was always possible. He'd been wrong about that last part. Some people, like Mateo Bellini, were beyond redemption. But Giuseppe had been right about the important things, about community, about kindness, about building something that fed people in more ways than one. Valentina pulled out her phone and called the number she'd saved weeks ago. Mr. Restrepo, this is Valentina Bruno. I'm ready to talk about buying back the lot. The conversation took 15 minutes. The price was higher than she'd hoped, but manageable with the reward money the FBI had mentioned. She could rebuild. Not the same bakery. That was gone forever, but something new that honored what had been. When she hung up, the sun had broken through the morning clouds, throwing light across the empty lot. Valentina stood in that light, feeling its warmth on her face, and realized that for the first time in 18 months, she wasn't angry. The fury that had driven her, that had given her the strength to walk into Matteo's world and dismantle it from inside, had finally burned itself out. What remained was quieter, more solid. Not peace. She wasn't sure she'd ever have that, but purpose. The knowledge that she'd taken her father's death and turned it into something more than tragedy, that she'd stopped a man who would have hurt countless others, that she'd given Laura a chance to become someone better. Silence had finally returned. Not the silence of things hidden and suppressed, but the silence of completion, of justice served, of a story ended and another ready to begin. Valentina smiled, turned away from the empty lot, and walked into the sunlight, carrying her father's memory and her own hard-won wisdom toward whatever came next. The loudest laugh in the room had preceded the longest silence, and in that silence she could finally breathe. Thank you for watching. If you loved this video, kindly hit that like button and subscribe for more.